I'm Michael Berkman.
And I'm Chris Beam, and from the McCourtney Institute for Democracy at Penn State, this is Democracy Works.
Chris, today we have as our guest Frank Baumgartner. Frank is a former colleague of mine at Penn State. He's now a professor of political science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And he, along with two of his colleagues, have written a really fascinating and important book called Suspect Citizens: What 20 Million Traffic Stops Tell Us About Policing and Race. Frank got a hold of from the state of North Carolina data on all their traffic stops over a multi-year period. Yes. So these are all traffic stops within North Carolina. And essentially they're asking who gets stopped and what happens after they get stopped and what are the biases in these stops.
And we thought it was important to talk about this subject because this is kind of the other side of the coin of what we referenced with our topics on Colin Kaepernick. What he and the other players were arguing is a hopelessly biased police system.
Right. I mean, Kaepernick is one part of a larger movement, which has really taken on power and force over the last several years, having to do with the unequal treatment of African Americans by police. Kaepernick is talking mostly, as are many of the other NFL players, about police shootings, but it absolutely encompasses the wider arena of how African Americans are just treated differently by the police and the implications of that.
Right, and I think that's something that we in this podcast, it's good for us to bring this to light, to really speak to what happens to African Americans as a result of this kind of basic fundamental unfairness.
Well, unfairness, it's a basic civil rights issue. I mean, the argument and what's confirmed in the data is that they are treated differently. They're being treated differently by the police.
Right.
There's other evidence they're treated differently in the criminal justice system. And we have a podcast coming up shortly where we'll talk with somebody about the inequities in the incarceration system as well.
Right, which is just steps along the way. Towards incarceration. Yeah, so I think it is a really good topic for us. It's timely, but again, our job here is to talk not just about topical issues, but to say how these implicate democracy, and the implications here are serious, important, and things that all of us should be aware of.
Yeah, so let's go to Jenna and hear from Frank.
This is Jenna Spinelli here today with Frank Baumgartner from the University of North Carolina and author of Suspect Citizens: What 20 Million Traffic Stops Tell Us About Policing and Race. Frank, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
So I don't normally like to start with origin stories, but I think this one is perhaps worth telling. So 20 million traffic stops. Can you tell us how the state of North Carolina came into possession of this information and how it ended up in the hands of you and your colleagues?
Okay, sure. That is a good question. Back in 1996, I think it was, an investigative reporter for the local newspaper, the Raleigh News and Observer, by the name of Joe Neff, did an investigative report about the possibility that a certain drug unit of the State Highway Patrol was searching Black and Hispanic drivers at a higher rate than white drivers, and that they were potentially really targeting these individuals on the highways. And that led to a serious inquiry and denials on the part of the Highway Patrol, but also the late 1990s were a time when there was a lot of increased concern for this thing that people were beginning to call driving while Black back at the time. And North Carolina became the first state in the nation to mandate collecting traffic stops. So since 2000, the Highway Patrol has been doing it. And then since 2002, the law was expanded to cover every police department in the state. So that's how they started collecting the data. And then I was asked to volunteer to look at the data for a task force of defense attorneys in 2011. So I was presented with a CD that had the data and asked if I could figure out how to get my hands around it. So I've been working on it for 7 years now.
Can you walk us through, based on what you found, how a traffic stop experience might differ for, say, a middle-class white man versus a young African-American or Latino man?
Yeah, so as a middle-class white man myself, I can tell you my personal experience is that I very rarely have any interactions at all with the police. And and when I do, it's always very respectful and I would say either by the book or else very helpful to me. The last time I was pulled over, I think was probably 25 years ago. This never happened to me in North Carolina. It happened to me in other states. But anyway, the point is that it's extremely rare. For a young man of color, it would be frustratingly common. And one of the things that we show in the data is not only is it very common, but it's also very commonly fruitless. That is to say, the traffic stop leads to just a warning or maybe no action at all. It's less likely to lead to a ticket. A citation is less likely if the driver is African American, but it's much more likely, about twice as likely, to lead to a search of the vehicle. And certain combinations, such as certain neighborhoods, certain times of the night, like at 2 a.m, for a young man of color, the search rate might be 15 or 20%, whereas the average overall is less than 3%.
Right. And so what did you find is kind of the cause of this disparity in search rates?
Well, we really think that there's a stereotype that police are faced with a very difficult, low information situation when they're looking at a driver in a routine traffic stop. And inevitably, it seems that they use visible cues to indicate to themselves whether they think that person might be engaged in suspicious activity. The interesting thing about the legal precedents here is that the Supreme Court is made up mostly of white middle-class men like me, and they've kind of used their own experiences, I think, informally in informing the law. And so the court has said routinely that it's only a momentary inconvenience, and any individuals could be subjected to an occasional stop and search for the in the interest of the public good. And since it's only momentary, and implicitly, I think they assumed it would be very rare for any individual, like it would be for me or for most justices of the Supreme Court, they said that it was a trivial inconvenience. And I think that's where the mistake gets made, because it's not that uncommon. Philando Castile, who was killed after a traffic stop up in Minnesota, had been pulled over, I think, something upwards of 35 times in his short lifetime.
Yeah, you cite that in the book. You said 46 times in 14 years.
Yeah, so if I'm going to be pulled over once every 25 years as a middle-class white man, it's clear that I just can't routinely empathize with somebody who lives on a different side of town and who might routinely be targeted by the police. I've never experienced that myself. And that's where I think the empathy gap comes from, where people just can't believe that it could be happening.
Right, and we'll come back maybe at the end toward some of the impacts that this research has had. But on the police side of things, you also point in the book to something called risk management policing. Can you explain what that is and how it figures into this picture?
If you think back to the 1960s, or you think back to your history books about the 1960s, depending on your age, police focused on solving crimes once they had occurred. But there got to be a very big shift in the philosophy and ideology and professional practices and norms within policing in the 1970s. It really started. And that was to see if the police couldn't use certain social and psychological demographic profiles about who criminals are and what they likely look like, if they couldn't then interrupt the criminals before they committed a crime. And so policing became much more proactive and much more aggressive. And the magic about this system was that it didn't happen to middle-class white people. It didn't happen on the nice side of town. It happened on the other side of town, maybe at night or during the day, but to people with very little political voice and ability to protect themselves politically. People who were seen as either expendable or likely criminal elements. If you're a young Black or Hispanic man with an older car and out-of-state plates, driving late at night, you're just in a different world than an Asian American lady driving in rush hour.
Right, and in some cases, the police, you say in the book, are kind of using the minuscule pieces of the traffic code as an excuse to pull them over and do searches for drugs or other substances.
Yeah, the interesting thing was there was a deputy sheriff down in Florida whose county sheriff's office had some jurisdiction over Interstate 95. I think it was near Daytona, Florida. And he decided that he was concerned about drug couriers driving through their jurisdiction. And so he routinely was pulling over Black and Hispanic drivers as they went up and down I-95. And judges were throwing out his cases because he didn't have any excuse or explanation for why he pulled over this driver other than their ethnicity or race. So judges were throwing him out. So the deputy sheriff, who then later became quite well known and he was elected to be sheriff, did some research. And the research suggested that if you had a crack on your license plate holder, or if you had a shadow extending over your license plate, or if you had any crack or malfunction in any part of your vehicle, that he could pull you over for cause, and it was a legally justified traffic stop. So that's the vehicle part of the equation. The other part is the traffic law itself. If you were going 54 miles an hour in a 55 zone, he could say that you were obstructing traffic. You were impeding the free flow of traffic. If you touched the white line, he could say that you were driving on the improved shoulder. Obviously, if you were speeding, as most drivers do routinely on the interstate highways, he could pull you over for speeding. And once he had a legally justified reason to pull you over, then it was open season because he could talk to you and ask for permission to search your vehicle and use all the kind of informal forms of influence that an officer might have to do what he wanted, which was to search the vehicle.
The line that the police use to describe this is you have to kiss a lot of frogs to find your prince, or there's any number of metaphors that you can use to describe this. But does the likelihood of finding something match up with the proportionality under which people are pulled over?
The numbers just don't add up. You have to stop tens of thousands of people before you find one or two significant contraband hits. So we looked at the contraband hits in North Carolina, and in virtually every case, the median size of the contraband hit is 1 unit or less than 1 unit. And it's vanishingly small numbers of times did we find in the data that really large amounts of contraband were found in a routine traffic stop. That takes intelligence. And using the traffic code as just an excuse to pull people over for a hunch makes sense if those people have zero political power and if we ascribed no value at all to their time and sense of self-worth. But if we're willing to ascribe any value at all to their time, their convenience, their sense of full citizenship, then we have to recognize that there's a cost for each one of these fruitless searches. And there's hundreds of thousands of these fruitless searches across the country every year.
Right. And let's talk about that cost a little bit. So what impact do all of these stops and searches have on democratic participation for these folks who are being pulled over and searched?
Even just a simple interaction with the police officer, such as a questioning or a traffic stop, could reduce the likelihood that someone will vote by as much as 10%. And in our research, we looked at it in a little bit of a different way. We identified that in those communities in North Carolina where the African American segment of the population has significant political power, such as several seats on the city council and a large share of the voters in the previous election, the racial disparities in the traffic stops in those communities are significantly lower. Even so much that in the communities with the highest level of political power for the Black community, there are no statistically significant racial disparities in search rates. And even Black drivers in those towns are more likely to get a ticket. You might think that a ticket is a bad outcome for a traffic stop, but getting a ticket indicates that there was a good reason to pull you over. Not getting a ticket indicates that perhaps the officer just pulled you over because he wanted to talk to you, and that your driving really didn't merit the sanction of a ticket. So there is a big cost, and I think that when we think nationally in the bigger picture about why is it that many men, especially men, but women as well in minority communities don't trust the police, and we overcome our empathy gap to look at the numbers and understand that in that community, the police might very well be playing quite a different role, not protecting and serving, but really intervening and being much more aggressive and kind of hassling people in the hopes of breaking up a crime. And then we have to ask, well, are they breaking up a lot of crimes? And I can say that using the traffic code and using routine vehicle stops as a method to do that is just extremely inefficient, and it alienates people and it makes them not trust the government.
It sets up a vicious cycle, right, where there's people who already don't have a lot of political power. Then these incidents happen and they're less likely to vote and become engaged. So they even have fewer seats at the table or less of a voice in the conversation than they would have had otherwise.
Yeah, and then the virtuous cycle we can see because we also were able to look at some cities in North Carolina that instituted some reforms. And in Fayetteville, North Carolina, they reduced the use of the traffic code as a kind of a method to hassle people. And it turned out that the crime rate went down and the calls to 911 per crime started to go up. And so people in the community who were no longer being subjected to what they considered to be unduly aggressive police practices in their side of town began to trust the police more and call into 911 when they suspected some difficulties in their neighborhood. So that was a real success story, and I think we could thank the police chief in Fayetteville for some real leadership there.
In some of the ways that these incidents are framed in the media, thinking about Philando Castile and other kind of high profile incidents like that, the police often point to bad apple police officers, or try to kind of paint this as this is just one or two problem officers that might have biases or other factors going on. What does your research say about that? Is it truly just a couple of bad apples, or is there a larger kind of systemic problem going on here?
And the short answer is that it's both. In our data set for North Carolina, we have an ID number for every police officer, although we don't know their name or their anything about them, but there is an anonymous ID number. And that allowed us to cluster all of the traffic stops and searches officer by officer to see if indeed there were any officers who had very unusual patterns of stopping or searching only the Black or the white or Hispanic drivers or whatever the case may be. And indeed, we did find a lot of officers who stood out from their colleagues. But on the other hand, we found systematic patterns where the typical officer had really significantly higher rates of searching Black drivers as compared to white drivers, especially among men. The racial disparities are much lower among female drivers. But in any case, when we controlled for what we called these bad apple officers, the systematic and institutional practices were still present. So I think the short answer is really accurate. It's both. There are bad apple officers, and we brought many of them to the attention of their supervisors across North Carolina. And I think some actions have been taken in a few cases. But it can't be limited to that. We can't accept an idea from a police chief who would love to believe that he's just got 3 or 4 officers that are causing all the problems of community mistrust. That's just not true. It's much broader than that.
In a couple of days here, we're going to be doing an interview with your colleague Peter Enns from Cornell. I know he has a blurb on the back of your book, and he's mostly just written. He's just written a book about incarceration, which is kind of like the other end of this problem. In some ways, I think you touch on this in your book that African American and Hispanic folks who get pulled over, if they don't pay their fines or if they're already behind, that they could end up going to jail over a traffic violation, right?
That's for sure. From speaking with police officials, I've learned that, that computer in the officer's, that laptop computer in the patrol car allows an officer who might be stopped at a stop sign to run the license plate numbers of the people stopped in front of him. And if there's a warrant for someone's arrest for an unpaid court fee or unpaid child support or any other misdemeanor, or of course it could be a felony as well, but oftentimes the court systems are loaded up with many, many cases of small misdemeanors. And when you drive your car, the officer in a patrol car on his computer can look that up instantaneously. And so it really does lead to a spiral downward of increasing involvement in the criminal justice system. And of course, once the officer pulls you over for an existing warrant, he's going to search your car. And if he does, or he's going to be likely to, and if he searches everybody's car, he's going to find some marijuana, typically a very small amount. In the cases where he does find it, of course, he won't always, but it's going to subject that person to an increased level of surveillance. And then that has a certain probability of leading to another problem with the law. So these definitely are spirals, and it's good to stay out of them. But once you fall into that spiral, it can be very difficult to get out.
And so you mentioned one kind of reform that happened earlier on the city level. What other impacts have these findings had since the book was published and since you've kind of been out there trying to tell this story about what we can glean from all these traffic stops?
Well, I think one thing that's happened is a lot of police chiefs and police leaders around the state and the nation have been looking at their own statistics more carefully. One of the lost opportunities in all this work that North Carolina has put into collecting the data is that the central office that collects it, first of all, never issued a single report. So nobody was aware of any of these patterns or how ubiquitous they are. And so any city that might have been the subject of some kind of study would feel that they were being unfairly singled out. And I like to be careful not to try to single out any particular places because the patterns that I've seen, they are a little bit worse in some places than in others, but they're pretty much everywhere. I mean, the average increased likelihood of search in North Carolina for a black driver is over 100%. In Ferguson, Missouri, when the U.S. Department of Justice did their investigation into all the terrible scandals in that police department, the increased likelihood of search was 70%. And so North Carolina, on average, is worse off than Ferguson, Missouri. And a lot of people would point to Ferguson as an epicenter of a particularly bad community police relations. But it's not really that much better in many other places. So I think that we have to recognize that the data are very consistent, the patterns are very clear, and I think it's also worth questioning in the police world whether we're really getting a lot of bang for our buck with using the routine traffic stop as a mechanism to fight crime. I think that most police leaders would recognize that there's got to be a better way. This is alienating people and not providing very much to show for it. This issue has not gone away, so there's been some real organizational structure behind keeping this issue of disparate treatment in criminal justice, but in policing in particular, on the national agenda. And I think it's been a difficult conversation, but it's I think one that is not going away. The numbers keep coming. People keep doing more and better studies. And the data that I've analyzed certainly, are robust. There is no way that you can make these disparities go away. And I think police departments have come to understand that rather than suggest that there are no differences in policing across race and gender, we have to recognize that there are very significant differences and then ask whether it's worth it, whether it's justified, and whether we get a public safety benefit from it. And the answer seems to be no, we don't. As a matter of fact, we're probably paying a significant cost because of the reduced trust in government and trust in the police. So that's something that I think every American should be concerned about.
Right. Well, thank you for helping us close the empathy gap a little bit here today on our podcast.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, well, so that was a lot of stuff to chew on. Maybe not 20 million data points worth, but there's a lot of stuff going on here. I think one thing that I thought that Frank mentioned that directly followed from what you were talking about was this idea of the importance of, or the impact, the inevitable impact of inequality.
Yes, I believe he referred to it at some point as not a sense of full citizenship.
Uh-huh.
And that this then has implications down the line, that it affects how one perceives of their efficacy in the political system, their sense that they want to, that their sense of that they can meaningfully be involved and should be involved. It may be hard to give the flavor of it a little bit. And sometimes I think the dash cams are really valuable for this. But this is a terrifying thing.
Right.
When you're pulled over and suddenly they're searching you.
But I think it's what's interesting to me is how fundamental to this whole experience and the reaction. It's not simply that you're pulled over. It's not simply that you're searched. It's that there's this fundamental unfairness to the whole thing. I'm being pulled over and I'm being searched because I'm a young black male. And that's the only reason. And you know it and I know it. And I rage against that fundamental unfairness.
Right, and I think that's one of the most interesting parts of this whole project is how they talk about like who's most, what are some of the signifiers that might lead a car to get pulled over.
Right.
And among them is that the driver is black, but then also there are economic indicators as well. A broken taillight it can get you pulled over, but especially with a new car, replacing a broken taillight is incredibly expensive.
Right.
But then also what happens once they're pulled over, that this is that they're using these traffic stops, which often don't result in tickets because there really wasn't a meaningful traffic violation, as essentially an excuse. To
a legal excuse, but nevertheless an excuse.
Right, to search a car, search somebody's car.
Right. The other thing that I think that is hopeful in this book, because it is a pretty damning indictment, is his note, what he said about Fayetteville and how this vicious circle of African Americans being treated unfairly, which moves them away from politics, which makes them less represented, which makes them more likely to get pulled over, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, can be turned around. And, he mentions Fayetteville as being a place where if we just move back to a different standard of probable cause, we end up with a town that is just as safe and where citizens feel more efficacy, more empowerment, and more equality.
Yes, and the other side of that were their findings, which I think are among the most important findings I have in the book, which is that in communities where African Americans have more political power, there's less of this sort of discriminatory behavior. Where they have less political power, there's more of it. Now, this tells us a couple things that are important. It tells, first of all, why opening up avenues to political power, helps to ensure fairness. Right. But it also speaks to. Jenna got at this in a somewhat different way with Frank in terms of individual police officers. This is not a problem as it is often presented as only a bad apple cop. which is a problem, but is dealt with in one set of ways. But rather, this is a systemic political issue.
Right.
That the way the government carries out its responsibilities bureaucratically is a function in part of who controls government, of political power. And the, so if you think about the kind of, historic, prolonged, effective ways in which in the South in particular, but not exclusively, African Americans were kept away from political power. This book just starts to give a little picture of how that works its way through the system. And there are other ways too. And so really, I just really commend this project.
Well, it really does speak to we talked, I don't remember which episode, about, the different kinds of representation and the different arguments about whether an individual of one kind can represent genuinely a person of another kind, and how in some cases, yeah, absolutely they can. But in some cases, those experiences are fundamentally different, and those differences matter. And so there's a good reason for why women want to increase representation. There's a good reason why Latinos want to increase representation, because that's the best prospects for them receiving fair treatment in a democracy.
From the McCourtney Institute for Democracy at Penn State University, I'm Michael Berkman.
And I'm Chris Beam, and thank you very much for listening.
This has been Democracy Works.